Well, welcome to the EGU Great Debate 4, which is rewards and recognition in science. What value should we place on contributions that can't be easily measured? I'm Robin Bell. I'm here in my role as president of AGU. My day job, I'm a glaciologist. I study the ice sheets at Columbia University and the Earth Institute. And I'd like to thank all my co-conveners, the EGU and the JPGU. This is really an effort to globally look at this problem and see if we can get ourselves to think about how do we see where our science is moving. One of the things we're thinking about at AGU is we've actually just hit, this is our year, the centennial, which means AGU has been in place for 100 years. It means that geophysics, as we all know it, has been operating as a community for 100 years. That means we've been making this, and when you stop and think of what we've learned in those 100 years, we've learned how old the Earth is. We've understood that the plates move from our sediment cores. We've understood how climate changes. And we've actually now understood the role humans are playing in climate change. So geophysics has gone from a tremendous expansion over this 100 years. And I think where we are now is as we look forward to the next 100 years, it's very clear that our science is going to be the science in the next 100 years, because it is our science that is really going to be the science that underpins the future of our species on this planet, and that what we do is going to be essential for the future of our communities as we know them. And what that raises is that as we look to the future and we think about what the future scientist is going to be, we're hearing more and more that science is changing. We're moving to open science. Our young colleagues are increasingly wanting to see the connection between their science and solutions, their science and work in the communities. They're forcing us to think about redefining what a scientific career is and what we reward in a scientific career. It really makes us stop and think, what is the definition of a success? You know, should I introduce our illustrious panel here by 15, 5, don't know, 55 and 50? That's not a very rich introduction. These people are way more interesting than those numbers. They actually, and I think that's something we have to reflect on, is what is it that our values? Is it a simple numeric metric, or do we want to have a richer, deeper metric? And that's what the discussion is going to be today. How is it we place value on what we do as science, recognizing as we're moving forward, we're going to see a broadening of our definition of what a scientist is and where our science has impact. So the way we're going to run today is Helen Glaves is my co-moderator, and we are going to have 3 presentations from our esteemed panel, and they're each going to talk for about 10 minutes about one facet of how we might consider rewards and recognition in science. And after each of the talks, we'll have a couple of clarifying questions from the floor. If you want to ask them a question, come up to the mic and ask them, but we aren't going to go into a debate until we get through all of them. But I want to make sure we all understand what each of our presenters have put on the table for us to consider. And then Helen and I will start by asking a couple of questions of our panelists, and then we'll open up to the floor for a larger debate. So we're going to start with our first presentation today, which is Liz Allen, who's Director of Initiatives at F1000. She's a visiting senior research fellow at the Policy Institute of King's College of London. So we're going to start with Liz.
Thanks, Robin. Thanks for the introduction, and thank you for inviting me to the EGU to present and take part in this debate. I'm really interested. I've been working in science policy for the last probably 20 years. As we were talking on the panel, I have a very low H index. I publish a little bit. I publish lots of policy-related documents, but I kind of contribute, and it's really important that I think we think about things very holistically, but there's lots of challenges in actually doing that, and it's very easy to criticize the kind of world we're in terms of metrics, but actually what we've got to try and do is think about what are the alternatives and how to actually make that happen. And I also wanted to just add, I'm actually a geographer originally, so this is great. I usually go to life science related conferences and don't understand anything. So I've been popping in and out of sessions and having quite a nice time actually. So thank you again for inviting me. So this is kind of the quote that I use a lot. I've used it for years, and when Alberto set up the actual session, I kind of thought this is really capturing what we're trying to do and one of the big challenges with metrics in science. It's been attributed to Einstein, and this kind of speaks to the whole problem, but a lot of people query whether that is actually Einstein's quote, but it'll do. It's a great photo, and it actually says, the actual quote is great. I put it in comments, attributed to Einstein. So, but it goes to, the whole issue of attribution of things that people say and do. But actually it's key here that, things that you can count, they're not always important. Things that you can't count might be just as important, and we need to balance that, but it's not easy. So when I sort of took the debate title, and again, we'd really love a great debate here today. I don't have the answers, and I'm not sure my panel, I'm speaking on behalf of having not heard them, but it's a really tricky issue, and it's difficult to please everybody all of the time. But actually, in essence, the value of things we can't measure, it's simple. It's a lot. But actually, it's not about what you can and can't measure. It's about knowing what the right thing is that you want to do for science. It's about trying to not look at what you can measure and assume that's a proxy indicator for various things. It's about thinking what is the right thing that we want to incentivize for the benefit of the big picture. And I think what's happened with lots of the kind of focus on evaluation, particularly around publishing, is that almost by accident, I say by accident in quotes, there's been various debates about whether there's conspiracies, and the publishing industry has kind of really carried on drivening and propagating the need for journal impact factors and things like that. But actually, scientists have really become a slave to the publishing metrics. And this has happened historically. Basically, science, we know that it's a massive producer of knowledge. It does many other things, but actually, in essence, that's what it was. And the first thing we used to do is write papers. We publish and we share the work that we've discovered. We put it in journals, Journals have been around since the 1600s. In the last sort of 50 years, I've been quite generic there. They've basically escalated into a kind of real industry. They support science, they totally support science, and I work for a publisher, science publisher. I previously worked at a funding agency, so I do wear two hats. But essentially, journals capture science outputs. It's really important that researchers report their outputs, and historically that's happened. Journals have been containers, libraries have been the place where these journals were accessed, but actually that's changing. In the sort of 80s particularly, and I used to work in an evaluation team at the Wellcome Trust, there was a massive rise. I wasn't there in the 80s, just to say, I'm not that old. I'm quite old, but I'm not that old. But there's been a massive rise in, justifiably trying to find out what happens with the public money that's invested in science. How can you tension that against the money that's invested in other parts of the economy? What is the benefit? What works, what doesn't work in science? And we've not been great at the latter part of that, but actually it's really important to think about how can we know the return on investment. It's a jargon phrase, but it is important to think about that. It is important to think about what we get for the investment in science, and therefore what's good for science, what do we incentivize and invest in. So this has happened. And therefore, what was out there, what's easy to capture? It's easy to develop metrics around a system that existed. There's lots of metrics around published behavior. Now, we know this has happened, and therefore, I think what's happened is the whole reliance on that metric area has kind of happened almost not by accident, there's certainly not totally by accident, but in the absence of anything else, there's been a real focus on containers and knowledge related to published work in the absence of any system to capture or even describe other things. And we all know this. This is a well-known phrase used in a lot of the evaluation work. It's kind of called Goodhart's law, that, you know, when a measure becomes a target, it ceases to be a good measure. We kind of know that. And I found this on Twitter recently, which is where I find everything. Basically, it's a really nice illustration of, you know, the publish or perish culture for researchers. Don't know if you can, but basically it's escalated. And I think one of the things to remember about this as well, this is totally true when a measure becomes a target. You can gameplay, it ceases to become a good measure. But actually, the journal impact factor was never invented to be used for the purposes that we're using it for. And we forget that, and evaluators forget that. It was generated for libraries to decide which articles to buy in the 60s. And we've, in the absence of developing anything else robust that can help us make decisions when you're faced with huge numbers of grant applications, when you're faced with huge numbers of tenure appointments, we need to make decisions. There do need to be decisions made, but actually nobody's really taken it until recently to do anything else. So we criticize and we use proxy measures, but actually what we need to do is develop alternatives. So the challenge for today is basically try to rethink this. How can we reconcile what's good for science with what is good for scientists? Now, because we know at the moment the focus on journal-based metrics and article-based output as the only and the major currency on which scientists are judged isn't holistic. It doesn't reflect, the true benefits of science, but also it causes lots of damage. And this is one thing that I just wanted to focus on as well. I think it goes back to us using metrics that weren't designed for the purpose that we're using them for, and us all playing this game, is that basically we don't never step back and think about the science system. Today it's very different than it was 50 years ago. Even 50 years ago it was very fragmented. So you have a funder, you have an institution, you have a scientist, you have researchers in different places, you have policymakers, you have publishers, all doing something in the same system, but very rarely talking to each other in a constructive way that's really helped, particularly this field. Different players have different goals, so the aims of a publisher, even though it is about helping science, it's not necessarily the same as what a funder's aim is or a researcher's aim. There has, in the evaluation system, been a really, in my view, I've done a lot of evaluation work, a really unhelpful focus on just the outputs of research. If you're thinking about efficiency in science, you need to think about the money that went in, how the funding process works, the peer review process around the grants, the employments at the institution. It's part of a system, and we have fixated very much on the outputs, which also hasn't helped. And then we know that the fixation on published outputs has created all kinds of problems in science, which we're now unpicking. So the reproducibility bias, which you particularly see in psychology and a lot of the life sciences, reporting biases, and that people save their best work and cherry pick and try and get in the highest impact journal that they can. But actually, there's a lot of really great stuff that's maybe incremental, maybe negative, null results. That should be out there to stop us wasting research and duplicating, and a negative result is just as important as a positive result. And then I think for me, the big thing, and this is something that we really can address, is there's a lack of infrastructure to provide any information, be that qualitative or quantitative, on the other things that scientists and researchers do that we want them to do for the good of science, that can help complement any journal-based metrics or article-based metrics or whatever you want to use in a more holistic way, and therefore you have a suite of information that you can use. This is happening. We talked about this very much in the debate yesterday. People are publishing in different ways. Things are happening anyway. So actually, I do think things are changing. I'm seeing this now. People are publishing outside of journals. They're publishing blogs. They're publishing things that basically have a digital footprint that are tied to individuals. And I'm really optimistic about this will help to reduce some of the focus on a published work in a very high impact journal, because there are alternatives. Many of these methods are much quicker. They do the same job, but we need to make sure that we build this into a system. You can cite different kinds of measures now. A lot of research outputs have digital outputs, digital footprints, so data, resources, software. You can publish these on their own now. You don't have to write them in a container of an article. People are doing this too. Different disciplines are taking this on more, but actually, if you've got a digital footprint for something, you can use it in a different way. You don't necessarily have to craft it into the traditional article with everything pulled into one piece. Contributions, this is something that I've been working on. A lot of life sciences journals are now looking at actually capturing in a structured format contributor roles when somebody publishes an article, instead of focusing, again, people have erroneously used a proxy of first author to last author as a reason for judging someone's output. Doesn't make sense, especially with massive multi-author papers. Somebody's done some great data work. You should be able to pull that person out and find them, know what data they've produced. It's just not that difficult. And then also review activity. This is coming through more and more. We know that peer review and all kinds of review activities that scientists do is kind of invisible to the system. It's a massive resource burden, but actually it's really hard to recognize that. This is coming too. So the fact you can get recognized and have a digital footprint for the review activity you've done through systems like Publons and linking stuff to your ORCID would really make a big difference. So I think, in summary, we need to change the narrative about this. We've been really negative. It's really easy to criticize. It's really easy to focus on what's wrong with journal metrics. But what we also need to do is find ways to address that, think of new ways. Researchers are key in this. Basically, it's a bottom-up thing, but it's also a top-down thing. When you go to a grants panel, it's researchers who sit on those grants panel and judge the grants. It's not the funding agency usually. The funding agency gives guidance, but actually it's the researchers who are judging other researchers, and it needs to come from the community. But what we need to do is remember what the goals of science are and actually incentivize those things. If it's not just about published outputs, then we need to make sure that that is very clear when someone's applying for a job, when someone's applying for tenure, when someone's applying for a grant. Importantly, though, we need to invest in the infrastructure. I'm not anti-metrics at all. I'm not anti-information. I think it's important to measure. Whether that's qualitative or quantitative, that's important. But the key thing is proportionality. It hasn't to be dominating everything. If it detracts you from doing the research in the first place, it's totally, the balance is wrong. So it's something about that. But the key thing here is we need to make sure that we connect things. So there's the diversity of output. People have a digital footprint. Metadata is massively important. Somebody yesterday at the Plan S discussion, I think it might have been AGU, said that some of their papers don't even have funding information on them. We can structure that. Why is that not there? It should totally be there. The researchers shouldn't have to keep adding stuff all over the place, because it supports everything, discoverability and analysis, everything. But actually, another thing is it's really important to work together. This is a system. Publishers for too long, particularly, and I'm speaking as a publisher, really have not been properly engaging with the process for all kinds of reasons. And it actually needs institutions, everybody needs to actually, and funders to actually work together to think about what it is you're trying to do and who does which bits. And then leadership. This is a key thing. And obviously, there's things like the DORA declaration. I'm not, do people know about the DORA declaration? Could people raise their hands if you've heard of the DORA declaration? Okay, it's actually quite a small proportion. So this stands for the Declaration on Research Assessment, which Stephen is really involved in. But there's lots of other organisations involved in, which is basically trying to advocate, you know, that funders and institutions and people think about research in a much more holistic way and don't just judge what you've done by where you've published. And that's really important. So I just want to finish on a kind of a nirvana slide. I don't know if this is the right slide, but there's 5 nice birds there and a sea, which I like. So the key thing here, I think, is what we need to do is actually rethink what it is that's good for science, that's good for scientists. And at the moment, those two aren't meeting in the middle. And actually, this is whole part of the metrics debate. What it is do we want to incentivize and make sure that that is what we incentivize. Thank you.
So if
That's just a joke.
That's just, okay. While you look at Liz's joke, if there are any quick questions on the content, not on the sort of debate-ness. Okay, I don't see anybody leaping up, so. Our next panelist, and Liz set him up very nicely by this allusion to DORA, is Stephen Curry, who's professor and assistant provost at the Imperial College of London, and he's the chair of the Declaration on Research Assessment, DORA. And now we're all going to be able to raise our hands by knowing what DORA is. So thank you very much.
So thank you for that introduction. So I am the chair of DORA, and I am therefore extremely disappointed in the lack of show of hands to that earlier question from Liz, but I guess that only shows how much work we at DORA still have to do. So what I'm going to say, as you will discover, overlaps quite significantly with a lot of what Liz said, but Liz is a much more practical person than I am, and I want to step back and think about some of the principles and values that I think we have to bring to this discussion. My opening slide is really to remind us that we need to think about the wisdom that we have to bring to the choices that we make in life. And that is something that will guide us when we think about our practices around research evaluation. So we're here to debate the question, what value should we place on contributions that cannot easily be measured? Now, as scientists, measurement's what we do, okay? It's how we've built our disciplines and won the admiration and respect of our peers and of the public for the wondrous ways in which we have illuminated the world. And it's only natural, therefore, that we should seek to turn our rulers and our compasses on ourselves as we try to assess and evaluate one another to decide who is the most successful, who deserves promotion, who deserves the job or the grant. So we're here today to debate this question because of the stresses and strains that we all know that an over-enthusiastic and ill-considered application of numbers or metrics or indicators in our process of research evaluation has brought to the academy in general. Now, when I am trying to think my way out of a problematic situation such as this one, I like to think about death, and I would encourage you to do the same. So this is the top of the top 5 regrets of the dying, the wishes expressed by people who know that they are at the end of their lives. I wish I'd had the courage to live a life true to myself, not the life others expected of me. But the difficulty, of course, we face every day in our lives, even if we think about this, a sentiment that I think probably resonates with a lot of us, rather uncomfortably perhaps in this room. But the difficulty we face day to day, of course, is that we are constantly distracted from our higher aspirations. How do we cling to our ideals in a world that seems to daily distract us from them? And the problem is perhaps particularly acute for academics because we need to forge a reputation for ourselves if we are to succeed in our careers. We are dependent on the evaluation and the opinions of others. And as Thomas Paine has written, reputation is what men and women think of us. Character is what God and the angels know of us. And even if you don't believe in God, you will hear his voice anyway. It is the sort of nagging voice of your conscience that is constantly reminding you about your higher aspirations. So unfortunately, in a scientific career, it's not enough really to be true to ourselves because we have to think about how others evaluate us. We have to convince others of our scientific worth. And the problem with that, of course, is that in our system of research evaluation, it seems to have made us prisoners of numbers, as Liz alluded to. We have been captured by citation counts, by journal impact factors, by H indices. And while these indicators are not entirely devoid of information that might be of some utility when it comes to research evaluation, they have taken over to an extent that is dangerous to the health of scientists and to the health of science. Liz has already alluded to some of the problems that arise in the body of the academy as a result of our obsession with numbers and with metrics. These include, and we can get into the discussion later, reduced productivity, displacement of attention from other important academic activities, a focus on the individual that undervalues the role and the contribution of teams, a positive bias in the literature which is contributing to a reproducibility or a reliability crisis, a focus on academic rather than real-world impacts, and a hyper-competitive atmosphere that tends to preserve the status quo and that is undermining our efforts to bring more equality and diversity to the academy. And as Rutger Bregman writes in a very interesting and intriguing book, Utopia for Realists, which I read because I am a utopian, governing by numbers is the last resort of a country or an academy that no longer knows what it wants, a country with no vision of utopia. Now, as Liz again has said, it's easy to be critical. We can all see and identify and enumerate the problems. It's much harder to come up with solutions. Now, Bregman's solution is quite radical. He suggests that we be unrealistic, unreasonable, and impossible. And I agree with him 100%. But I also think that if we are going to change the world, we have to be realistic, we have to be reasonable, and we have to think about what is possible. What can I tell you? I'm a bag of contradictions, like many human beings. So again, it's easy to be a critic. It's harder to think through the problem of evaluation creatively and constructively, but that's precisely what we're here to do this morning, and I look forward to the discussion. We have to really think about how we take a properly holistic approach. Now, there are already many bright minds working on this. I'll just point to one example that was published recently, or a couple of years ago, in fact. And this is about work done at the University Medical Center in Utrecht, led by Frank Miedema and Rinse Benedictus, where they have completely overhauled their entire approach to hiring and promoting their faculty. And instead of asking candidates to just submit a standard format CV, which of course will always list all the publications helpfully annotated with the impact factors, and the H-index of the investigator is usually placed somewhere prominently near the top. So instead of that, they've asked applicants to write a short essay. I think it's limited to 2 sides of A4 to keep it concise, which addresses 5 questions or attributes. Research, because they, as a medical research center, they're very interested in making sure that their staff are doing world-class research. Teaching and mentorship, a very important academic activity. Departmental citizenship, something else also important to keep the ship on the ship running. Clinical practice, because it's a medical center, obviously, and aspects of entrepreneurship and public engagement, policy work, and all the other sort of wider things that happen in the course of an academic life. So this structured narrative, or bioscape, gives a structured, consistent, and concise form of information that reviewers can use to appraise candidates, and it embraces both the quantitative and qualitative aspects of academic achievement. It's an honest and practical embrace of the principle that they announce at the bottom, that scientific quality is hard to define and even harder to actually measure. And I think we delude ourselves if we think that we can measure it. This is always going to be a matter of human judgment and bringing the appropriate expertise to the table. So while we are always going to be tempted to come back to metrics, and there is some useful information there in the indicators, the trouble is that they tend to break out of their box all too readily, and we let them escape. And so we have to really remember very much our ultimate values and our ultimate aspirations if we are to keep them under an appropriately tight leash. There's a simplifying power that they bring that's particularly appealing to non-experts who are often involved in research assessment, if we think about research managers at universities, for example. And we definitely have to resist this. There are sort of practical solutions. I can highly recommend this article by Atul Gawande, who is talking about cultural change, and actually to bring a new approach to research evaluation, we do need to think about culture change, because this is a problem that we have been living with for at least 20 years. So as humans, we yearn, of course, for frictionless technological solutions. That's the zeitgeist of the 21st century. Isn't there an app for that? But it's people talking to people that is still how the world's standards change. So it's only through discussion, and I think it will only be through endless negotiation about what we as a community think is important to us that we will figure out what the practical ways in which we can improve our processes of research evaluation. So on that note, I will conclude my opening remarks, and I look forward, hopefully, to a vigorous and constructive debate which is conducted in good faith, a quantity and a quality that is sadly lacking in British politics at the moment.
Great, thank you very much. Any quick questions? Okay, good. We're going to get them all at the end then. So our third speaker, to round out this wonderful reflection on what is that we reward in science, is Dimitris Kotianis, who's a professor and former dean of the Faculty of Engineering at the Technical University of Athens, the past editor-in-chief of the Hydrological Sciences Journal of IAHS. So we should welcome Dimitris.
So, should we place a value on unmeasurable values? That's my question. And I would like to start from the foundation. Actually, I'm a civil engineer. So the fundamental principles are about metrics, but also perhaps just a parenthesis to show you from the beginning of my thesis, my position. I believe metrics are good, are useful, but they should be limited to the things that can be measured. We do not need to assign numbers to things that are unmeasurable. And there are some negative experiences about that. Metrics can serve as thresholds and shortlisting criteria, but they cannot support final decision. That's my thesis, and that's the important elements that I could use for foundation of my thoughts. These are the two very, very important things in life, and one is money, and the other is love. I have some paintings to get a better feeling about what these issues are. Perhaps you know already, but I have also some scientific definitions. So, before I'm going to the definitions, let me remind you that they have some similarities. Both have a social content, not a physical content. They depend on credit, and both contribute to happiness. But they also have a very radical difference because the money is measurable. Actually, money, according to a definition that I have taken from a proper book, I guess, it is a unit of measurement. And then how you define love? Any ideas? It's a difficult subject. But I found a very nice definition, which I like very much, and I'm reading this definition to you. It's from the book by Peck. The book is named The Road Less Traveled, and I recommend this book. I define love thus: the will to extend one's self for the purpose of nurturing one's own or another's spiritual growth. It is very dangerous to mix the two, to mix the countable and the uncountable. And the dilemma of mixing measurable and unmeasurable things is very old. And there is a very old advice as well. Perhaps you know the story. If you don't know the story from the Bible, it's difficult to explain now, but let me just read the Greek version, with the original, and you see the translation. Απόδοτε ούν τα του Καίσαρος το Καίσαρι και τα του Θεού το Θεό. Okay, that's about the past. Now, a quick move to the present, and I wish to introduce you to our epoch by this salutation. Welcome to the narcissism. It's not mine, it's from this article by Mark Sagov, which I like very much because I think it expresses very well our era. He diagnoses that our capricious humanity accomplishes a counter-Copernican revolution. And there are several signs. For instance, the notion of the Anthropocene. Actually, he plays with the word Anthropocene, and he changes to Narcissene, which I believe is much more accurate than the Anthropocene. Of course, the narcissism has also affecting individuals. And in this landscape, it is very well, this narcissist behavior is also closely related to a landscape of wild competition. We have put absolute priority in research publications and even more emphasis on grads, and low priority in teaching. There is exponential growth of publications, but equal growth of meaningless publications. There is an increasing number of awarded PhD degrees, but on the other hand, we have this decline of formal positions in universities and research centers. We have substituted formal positions with postdocs, and this, in my view, is not healthy. These facts signify a widely competitive environment in which a new scientist have to struggle for academic success and an active career in science. Of course, there are many recipes how to do it better. I have copied a table here which I don't have the time to analyze and to say the details, but my presentation is available online, so if you have any comment, we can discuss it later, perhaps, or by email. Okay. But my basic question is, should we make the boat go faster? The direct reply is yes, but under some conditions. If our target is to win the Olympics, if the game's rules are specified and rigid, and if there is a single metric to measure success. In my view, none of these conditions is valid for the university. So, and I believe that following this model is perhaps a road to failure. Stephen before mentioned the way to utopia, and he spoke about the reasonable, unrealistic, and impossible, which are very good values, but I would see them from a different point of view as an engineer and also as a Greek, because we had very recently believed in my country to those values, and we are in a tragic situation by now. So I believe other countries are luckier. For instance, Italy, Britain, US have better political situation, but there are some countries, including mine, which have political problems. And when we complain about the bad situation of politics and political leaders in our countries and internationally, we must bear in mind that modern politicians and opinion makers have been educated in modern university. So the irrationalism, else known as political correctness, the poverty in ideas for social progress, and the political regression constitute the most spectacular evidence of failure of modern university. This is just my view. Of course, feel free to disagree. But I believe we do have some problems, and actually, as I was told by the President, Professor Montanari, in an hour from now, there will be a political talk about the problems of Europe. Am I right? Yeah, in this room, by Mario Monti. Okay, let's be more specific now. There is no doubt that quantitatively, the research efforts and outputs thrive. There is no shortage of metrics to count these outputs for individuals and collectively. But there are problems among the entire set of metrics. Just an example is that we have some papers by kilo authors, and counting the citations from these papers, we have a result of mega sites. Another issue is that the evaluations in most universities that I know gives emphasis on grants. And this reveals the managerial logic of modern universities. Shouldn't we question that? Is emphasis on money rational for a university, ethical, and socially progressive? Does it highlight the intellectual nature of the university? And all in all, is thriving of numbers an indication that we're in a good state? Now I replied with a quotation from a book, Alveson. Never before in the history of humanity have so many written so much while having so little to say to so few. And I fully agree with that. It's this book, Return to Meaning. These authors diagnose proliferation of meaningless research and rise of nonsense in academic research, but the numbers thrive. I recommend this book to read. It's much more information that I have to say to you. Okay, there are some innovations in the way we assess research. And of course, it is healthy to question a dubious assessment of research, and it's healthy also to seek innovation. I believe the development that was discussed before, which is about the dispute of the relevance of the impact factor of the journal where a paper is published, is very healthy. Did I get it correctly, Stephen? I agree with that, and I can sign the declaration, of course, about that. However, I think this is a very marginal initiative. It will not resolve many problems, and I believe it's not that effective. And my impression with getting in contact with youngsters is that they are unprecedentedly eager to publish in glamorous journals. So I'm not sure if they were influenced by such initiatives. Okay, then we have the innovative metrics like altmetrics. I believe these are a regression rather than progress, because I don't find a particular positive meaning in counting activity in social networks and using these numbers in order to assess science. This is my opinion. Of course, feel free to disagree. Another issue, the emphasis to open access. Yes, it's good, but it also has negative consequences, and particularly with regard to poor guys like me, who do not have a lot of funds, and they want to publish some research which they do for themselves without getting paid. How could these scientists sustain how could pay the high fee for publishing an open access journal in an open access? So I believe we need diversity. We need open access, it's okay, but we also need other types of business models. And open access is nothing more than another business model. So there is danger that these innovations would lead to worsening of an already unsatisfactory state of affairs. Teaching. What is more important for a university, for the society about the university? Publishing papers or writing educational books, lecture notes, and other educational artifacts that help students? Is it not the main mission of the university to educate students and to guide them to become professionals? And once educational artifacts are of value and are made visible, not kept in the class, aren't they an important community property? My own reply to this question is positive. Yes, yes. Finally, participatory work. This is also very, very important and includes traditional roles like collective work and collective scientific work and leadership of the community, like the ladies here. Yeah, this is very important for us, to lead us. And there are several innovative services that have been made possible because of the internet. For instance, new ways of communicating scientific results to the society, collecting, processing, providing open data to the community, open software also to the community, organizing information and providing it to the community. I have a very important example, is the initiative by Keith Bevan, who develops a wiki for the history of hydrology, and we all can contribute to this. The peer review system is the most demanding in terms of time and effort, and the most essential community service. And it is amazing that it has survived the explosion of the outputs. Some of these services are counted, some others should not be incorporated in the audit system, and I have a counterexample. Of course, I'm sure that most of you will disagree with me. I'm speaking about Pablons, a new system, a new platform that tracks the reviews made by independent reviewers. It mostly counts anonymous reviews. And my question is it ethical to track anonymous transactions? It's not, the question is not about if it is possible or if it is accurate. Is it ethical? Trying to get credit for anonymous transactions express an altruistic contribution to the society? Is it love? Or does it express a mixture of fear to be eponymous and responsible by name, and egocentrism, to translate every action in kind of monetary units? Okay, final slide. Academics are also role models, and I have listed some positive roles and the negatives. So, science versus sophistry, thought versus stereotypes, meaning versus nonsense, rationalism versus irrationalism, universality versus monomery, transparency versus concealment, honesty versus cheat, integrity versus deception, courage versus fear, democratic governance versus bureaucracy and technocracy, eponymity versus anonymity, participation versus solitude, dedication versus cynicism, and most importantly, love versus hate. Of course, this is just a collection. As you see, I can change them if you wish, if you don't like. Okay, I have already summarized my thesis. I started with the conclusions, but just to add a couple to those that I have already told. Instead of introducing metrics to the unmeasurable virtues, I propose to compile and announce a list of non-measurable services, primarily teaching, and ethical values like the ones that I listed before, which should be important for the individuals as well as for academic selection and promotion committees to consider. And finally, assuming that there exists non-artificial intelligence, humans are able to judge based on non-numerical criteria. Thank you.
So, is this on? Yes, it is. So I think what we're going to do is start by questions between Helen, I, and the panel, just because I think that'll be fun, and then we'll open it up to the floor. And what we've heard is a couple of different views of how things should move to the future, whether it's DORA or an increased emphasis on things that we aren't measuring right now, teaching, for example, or recognizing all the different parts that make our science. So my question for each of you is, you've each sort of proposed some sort of change. Where should that change start? And how are you, why don't we start with Stephen? Because you've already exposed your ideas to another 200 people who didn't know about it. And is this how you think it should start?
Well, I think it does have to start in fora like this. It has to start with the community. This is a problem that we have generated within ourselves. It's easy to blame publishers and journals because they're the ones that trade in impact factors. But actually, for publishers and journals, that's a rational and not unreasonable thing for them to do, because that's a piece of information that authors look at in order to make choices about where to publish. But overall, I think anyone who works in academia, who works in a university, understands the systemic nature of this. Liz and Demetrius both referenced this sort of the rise of managerialism, which is something that has come not just to universities, but to the entire public sector. We see it very acutely in Britain, but also to business. So managerialism is about there's a rise of a sort of professional cadre of managers who are not necessarily experts in the businesses or the activities that they manage, but they are experts in management. And so they rely very much on the generation of data, which now that the world is computerized, digitized, interconnected by the web, we imagine that that's far easier to do than it was before. The amount of data that we generate is enormous. We feel that we can track every particle of human activity and that there's great value in that, and that one can use that to manage and set the goals for and measure the performance of large organizations. Businesses do this all the time, hospitals do it. But there's a great book by another book. We should actually turn this into a book club, not a debate. I have to think of the number of references being cited. But there's a great book by Jerzy Müller called The Tyranny of Metrics, which I think describes the rise of the use of metrics across all areas of activity, not just, he is a professor, and that's where he first came across it, but he sees it in all cases. And there is value, of course, in quantitative data. As scientists, we're never going to deny that. And we do have to think about metrics, and I think sometimes the indicators and the numbers actually challenge our preconceptions, and so they're a very important part of informing human judgment. But Muller's warning to us is that if you just leave it to the managers to generate and use the numbers and to be making decisions about people's lives based largely on that information, then you get into all sorts of trouble, because then people start to play the game. As Liz said, you get Goodhart's law, the measure seems to become a measure. Doctors who are judged on performance become more reluctant to treat patients who are very sick because they're less likely to cure them, and therefore their performance metrics will go down. So people cheat the system if the system is simply requiring some sort of numerical measure from them. And that's why, and I think we all of us have shared this in our presentations, it's really important to make sure that what we're thinking about, what we're doing, is rooted in the values that we, I think, largely share. I don't agree entirely with Demetrius on his view of open access, but we'll get into that later. But largely share, but need to talk about, and need to talk about in good faith. And I think it really is about the community taking control of that. Universities are under enormous pressure from external audit, not just from governments, but from, goddammit, university ranking organizations who have become a tyranny in themselves. But they have captured the attention of university leaders in a way that I think Demetrius pointed out, that universities kind of lost their way a bit in terms of what their original mission is. And I think it's down to us, because the very meaning of university is a community of scholars and students. That's what the word originally means. And it's really our responsibility to re-engineer that and to refashion that to address these problems. So that's where it has to start, with us.
What, you want to answer that? Where do you think?
Okay.
Okay.
Ladies first.
He's still thinking. So I would agree with most of what Stephen said. I think the growth of performance measurement is kind of another term that's used for the whole, that's what's happening. And there are scarce resources, and it's really important to think about how that's done, but I really do think researchers are key in all of this. And you do hear it in the publishing industry now that actually maybe you dismantle the publishing industry, then you haven't got the metrics to use in the way that we currently use them, but I'm not actually sure that's totally helpful. Research output knowledge still needs to be shared somewhere. I think how we share it is something that is changing, and I do have a more optimistic sense on most of this, that actually if we simply not bypass the system, but have created alternative systems, which are happening now, then I think the reliance on a measure that's archaic, and everyone knows that nobody that I speak to in my circles think that the general impact factor is a really great reflection, but it has some value for certain purposes. But actually we would stop using metrics that are unhelpful if there were other things that were more helpful, and I think that's what we've really been very slow at actually coming to terms with. And I do think the publishing industry needs to really be part of the discussion and actually think about what it's doing with the way that it compiles metrics, and metric agencies as well, because a lot of publishers are now reinventing themselves as analytics agencies as well, which can be dangerous if it doesn't involve researchers and institutions and funders in the discussion about what it is that we want to actually capture and make metrics around, if we have to make metrics. So I think it needs to be a cross-community thing, but I think the researcher's voice is massively important and influential here.
Yeah, I believe it's a very nice question. Whether this that we did today could have a result. Is it that like this? That was my understanding. So that's great. If there is a result, would be even better. But
Hold it to your mouth.
okay.
Yes.
Okay. Better. Okay. So let's pick a couple of issues that we think they are mature enough, and put it in a list and try to promote those. For instance, the issue about the impact factor of journals. Could be one. Would you also agree? Panel, I don't know. Okay. Would you also agree that we should move away from the audit culture? Just some questions. What about making a list of non-measurable important issues? Would that make sense?
So let me.
Yeah.
So Stephen put on the table the example where a community, basically a school, decided to change the metrics. Is that where we should see this start? Is it going to be at individual institutions like your institution or Stephen's institution, or is it going to be a role the societies can take? How are we going to foster? I'm hearing kind of this sense that we have to think about how to change our reward culture. And the question is, how are we going to foster? Who are we going to be the leaders? Where do we plant those seeds? Okay, let's see what Stephen thinks.
So to come back to, it is going to be the community, it is us, although our communities are very diverse and different. So here we are at the EGU. I'm a life scientist, and life scientists and biomedical scientists are probably the worst offenders when it comes to obsessing about metrics and journal impact factors and whatnot. But so it certainly has to be part of us. And just to sort of continue the argument put forward by Geertje Muller, metrics do and indicators do have some uses, but actually they work most successfully when the people being evaluated by them are involved in the conversations and the design and decisions about how they are used and how those evaluations are going to take place. So if they buy in and understand where the value comes from, so again, to come back to a medical example, doctors will change the practice if the evidence is presented to them to show that, following a procedure in a particular way is bad for the outcome and choosing a different way is better. And that's the basis of much clinical research. And the same applies to other things in the academy. Demetrius talks about, can we change the audit culture? Okay, that's a big ask, okay, because with the sort of neoliberal consensus, I think, that has gripped much of the Western Europe and America, we see it very powerfully in the UK. That's going to be a difficult thing to do because that's an economic theory that a lot of people have bought into and a lot of political powers use. Our government certainly thinks about it when it's thinking about how is it planning investment in research and development and what, because that's where the evaluation culture comes from. But we do have to challenge that. Universities find it difficult because, again, they are judged not just by governments but by university rankers. And there was an interesting paper came out recently from the European Commission looking at the future of scholarly communication. And one of the interesting things to my mind, that came out of that was the role of funders in the research ecosystem, because funders are the one actor who are not ranked or evaluated, not yet anyway. Universities are ranked, journals are ranked, researchers are ranked, okay, and judged, and therefore feel this enormous pressure to play the game. But funders have more leeway, and of course they have enormous power because they're the ones that are paying the money. And that is why I think, so Plan S, which was discussed and debated yesterday, it's controversial, it's radical, it's bold. It has stirred up a lot of fear among, learned societies about, threat. Again, we can talk about open access later, but at least it has got the debate going, and at least there is a recognition that reform of research evaluation has to go hand in hand with any kind of reform of research evaluation and the audit culture or the evaluation culture that we want to bring to the table.
Make a comment on this. Yes, Steven, you started about the importance of Utopia, and then you led us to the difficulties because of the neoliberalism. Yeah, I think. I would like to take a position in the middle. Let's see our own role as academics. So don't care what the neoliberalism plans for us, but let's see our own. You also used the quotation, and the interesting quotation. What we want for ourselves. Can we tell that? Okay, if we can tell that, do we have means to that our voice can be heard? I believe we have. Just to remind you, last year there were several events throughout the world marching for science, which in my view was marching for money. For money for science. These are values, what we are discussing today, are values more important than money. It's about the ethics of our society and particularly of our university. So we couldn't start some initiative.
I just wanted to add as Stephen said, I'm very practical. I'd rather do something than talk about things forever and maybe do nothing, and I don't mean that in a bad way. But yeah, I'm talking about Utopia. I love Utopia, but hey, let's think about what we can do in the next 5 years. So there is something massively important about the funders in all of this, because I think the way that science is funded in short-term grants and the reason that you have to prove something within a short time period is you hook onto the thing that you can do the most easiest often, which is if you publish something, there's something concrete that you can show that you've done. And I do think that there's a lot of, as the phrase, tail wagging the dog rather than actually thinking about what it is that's being funded. So I do think funders really do need to come to the table and think about this more collectively as well, because the way that science is actually funded is making a massive difference into what people are trying to prove because of the audit culture, because of performance measurement. I think that's massively important. So funders do totally need to come to the table and discuss this.
Okay. Thank you. I just want to thank our contributors, because I think you've already touched on a number of the points that I think are regularly discussed in a number of the sessions that I've already been in this week. I just want to ask the panel, Stephen alluded to the utopian view of, and he is obviously very idealistic and would love the perfect solution to a number of these issues. But I think we all recognise that as things currently stand, academic peer review is entrenched in both universities and organisations such as those that I work for, because I work for a government research centre, and we are very focused on outputs and metrics that are around H indexes, which is why I enjoyed Robin's introduction, where I'm quite proud of the fact mine is 5, because much of what I do is around policy and white papers, and so they don't tend to get cited that much, either that or they are things that are very niche. So my question to the panel really is, Liz already suggested that one solution to breaking down this culture and this metric that we're currently wedded to is to perhaps dismember the current sort of publishing system. So that's one example of how we might break down some of this sort of, almost sort of pre-cooked prejudice there is around different roles in organisations and the need for you to publish to get credit. But I just wonder, do the panels feel that there is one specific cultural change or one technical advancement that's potentially a game changer in terms of how we give credit to people who not just are purely focused on research, but also are doing a number of the sort of the other roles in research that are fundamental to the success of research. So those people who are publishing data sets, and Liz already alluded to the fact that we're moving forward. But there are other people, there are those people who are responsible for maintaining the collections in museums that are actually key to research. There are the people who are working laboratories, in oncology laboratories, who don't tend to get credit. They're the 15th person named on a paper, maybe. And as Liz has already said, the fact that you're the 15th author on a paper means you don't really get a lot of credit for that. So I'd like to hear from the panel, do you think there's one potential cultural, technological change that could really take us forward in breaking down this?
Stephen's ready. You can pass.
Yes. So there's one, to my mind, very obvious and very powerful change that is already happening, and it's called openness. Okay, whether you call it open access or open science or open peer review, it's openness. It's actually the technology which has itself brought the social change. So Dimitris was rather dismissive of open access. He said it was good, but he says it's just another business model, and I disagree vehemently with that. It's a state of mind, I think, and it is a technological change, but it's one that is bringing great cultural change in its wake. We might think in many cases it's happening very slowly, but that's because we're living through it. I think people will look back on the beginning of the 21st century and say, oh my God, there was a complete transformation of the way that the research community started sharing its results. And I think openness is the key to lots of the problems that we have, both with sort of sharing credit and with solving some of the other problems of the fact that we've lost sight of some of the broader and more important issues of what doing research is all about. It's about understanding the world, making the world a better place, and sharing that understanding with the widest possible audience. So the particular changes that I think have come with openness that we've seen are the sort of rise of the use of preprint servers, which I think has come about to some extent stimulated by the advent of open access megajournals, which introduced a new editorial standard, which was, is the work novel, has it been done competently, and if both those boxes can be ticked, then it's worth publishing and sharing with the world. It's not down to the journal to decide whether or not this is really impactful or whether or not this is the sort of paper that is going to burnish my brand. Those are not unreasonable considerations for some journals, but actually as a reviewer I find myself increasingly reluctant to play the sort of the branding game. And I like the fact that peer reviews are definitely on the rise, certainly in the biomedical sciences, because you can, within preprints, I like the fact that preprints are on the rise, because within preprints there is no cover to look at. You have to judge the science on its own merits. And so there's a sort of subversive aspect to the rise of preprints that I really like, which is refocusing people's attentions on the content and making their own assessment of whether the work is very good. The rise of preprints has also generated activity in comments, and people feel more willing to comment on preprints because they know they can actually make a constructive contribution to help change and improve the paper. in order to, again, participate in dialogue. And I think open peer review is something that I would like to see more and more journals adopt. It's a minority of journals, of only about 3 or 4% that do it at the minute. But I think that's one of the things that would certainly increase the reliability of science. It would also kill off immediately the problem of predatory open access journals, which I agree is definitely a concern with the open access model. Some businesses are taking raw advantage of it. But if peer reviews were published, albeit anonymously, then predatory journals would go by the wayside. So those openness, that would speed up science, so that would address the productivity issue that I alluded to, and that productivity issue arises because people chase after impact factors, and so they submit to the top journal, they get rejected, they work their way down the hierarchy. I met a fellow at the Royal Society a couple of years ago who was on her 10th journal for a piece of work that she thought was among the best in her career, that she'd done in her career, and she had spent 18 months not publishing that. And I think if the general public, who probably funded the work, knew that those are the sorts of silly games that we were playing with the work that we did with their money, they would rightly be outraged. And I think that's why Dimitri mentioned the March for Science, and I think he's right. It was a march for money for science, and there was a disconnect with the wider population. And I think changing our attitudes to openness and to sharing will also help us to refocus our attention on our duty, which is something that I think we should also incentivize to connect with the public. Again, sorry to come back to Brexit again, but part of the problem in the referendum for universities was that our interests were completely dismissed because we had our noses in the EU trough. We only ever saw it as a source of money. And we were not able to connect with those communities, often in towns and cities that didn't have a university. We weren't able to tell them the stories and share the wonder that we generate and the good things that we do that actually impact their lives. They did not see what we meant to them. And that's a failing on our part that openness and that reorienting our incentive process can help to address.
Again, I have a comment. Can I?
Yes.
Yeah. Perhaps.
Close to your mouth.
Yes, perhaps I did not express myself correctly about open access. I'm all for open access. And actually, we have implemented in my group, since 2000, we have everything in our website openly. But I'm not speaking about that open access. And that open access includes also data, reports, whatever can be useful to people, everything is online, including this very presentation today, yeah, of course. But I'm speaking about paid open access. This is something different. This is a business model. It's a very nice business model if you are a publisher, because you get your money immediately. You don't have to look for subscribers, etc. You get the money from the authors. Okay, this is tricky. If you have funds, it's fun. It's okay. It's fine. But if you don't have a funded project, you may have a problem. That's my problem. Okay. With reply to your question, I think that there are a couple of things that could change. For instance, I mentioned already the importance of dismissing the general impact factor. This is a small change, but would be very effective, because again, this is kind of interwoven political and economic interests, in my view. Yeah.
Let's Liz, and then I think.
Yeah, and again, I propose to make a list of non-measurable values and say we have this list. Consider it. At least consider it.
Okay, just quickly, I'd agree with open, and I do agree with what they've just said, that we conflate open with open access business models, and I think we need to make sure that we describe things properly, which goes back to my whole, one of the things, the most practical thing that we can do. I think making things open is important, but not if it's not discoverable. So the key thing is that you start to attach metadata and things that you can find it. We can post stuff all over the web. We can put it in preprint servers. We can put it in journals. But if you don't have metadata, things like ORCID or funding information or links to all the authors and what they've done, then you'll never find it. And actually, it's okay to say, stick all your data out there, but if there's not good metadata to allow you to find it and search it and use it, then actually we're just not doing ourselves any service at all, and we'll be in the same position we are now.
Stephen, did you have one more?
Just very quickly. So this time I agree with Demetrius. So yes, we should dismiss the journal impact factor, and that is, of course, one of the things that DORA is setting itself to do. But as we saw from the show of hands at the beginning, there's still quite a bit of work to do there. And like many things, it's easier said than done. And I don't think we can dismiss it until we give researchers a degree of credibility in a research assessment system that will not take account of journal impact factors. And fine declarations are all well and good, and I'm certainly in support of them, and I would like people to sign them. But ultimately, we really have to think about providing practical alternatives to people that have robustness and that have the time efficiency that people attribute to the journal impact factor. They think they can just look at the numbers, and then they can make an assessment about work that is published perhaps outside their discipline because they're not actually comfortable making their own individual assessments. So we do have to provide those tools. The work done at UMC Utrecht is one very good example of an alternative mechanism that I think is working well, but it's an early days for the experiment. And there are a number of other institutions and funders that are experimenting. So there's quite a lot of change going on, but ultimately we do have to build a system that researchers have a belief in. And I think particularly early career researchers, and I've seen it in my own group, they are, PhD students and postdocs are far more obsessed with metrics these days than I was. I was certainly aware of them, and I kind of knew you had to play the game to work your way up the greasy pole. It's a slightly shabby pursuit. I'm not entirely proud of myself, but I'm very pleased that I did manage to do it. But and it's not enough for us to sort of shake our heads and say, oh no, it's terrible, but you shouldn't do what I did, okay? And actually I do think, and I think it was Liz mentioned, there is a real role for leadership here. Randy Sheckman, cell biologist, won the Nobel Prize a couple of years ago, and also a genius at PR, because on the day that he got his award, he said he was boycotting publishing in Cell, Nature, and Science. Now, he was called out as a massive hypocrite because he just won the Nobel Prize on the back of a career built on papers in Cell, Nature, and Science. But even so, he was drawing attention to the problem. And I think he was also in a position to protect the younger members of his group. I'm sure he had a discussion with them before he made this announcement, because they already have the sort of reputational benefits of being in Randy Sheckman's lab, because he's a Nobel Prize winner, and Randy Sheckman, in his reference letter, he can write, our lab's policy is not to publish. This person is a top-notch researcher because this is what they've done. And we do have to think about providing mechanisms which really describe what people have done.
Okay, I'm going to ask the panel one more question, and then we'll get to the, good, I'm glad, and what I was going to say is start thinking of your questions, and I can see your hand up. So after we finish this next dialogue, I'm going to have you come up to the microphone so people can hear your question. And other people who've been having simmering questions, please get ready for after that. But we're going to have one more conversation, which is, Stephen, you've really suggested that one of the things, and it's kind of been through this thread, that we need to move from numbers, which most of us are really quant, we're geeks, so we like numbers. We can get our heads around them, to more of a narrative. That's what you described at Utrecht. And we're humans, as Demetrius showed us, we love stories, right? We're going to remember the stories that our three panelists told us. But what worries me is, how are we going to make sure that we honor what we've seen as the rich diversification of science? And, having lived in, one of those awful cutthroat environments, and where somebody will get a job because so-and-so will write a one-line letter that says, you should hire X, period. So how are we going to make sure, if we move from something that's kind of quantitative to something that's more narrative, how are we going to make sure that we preserve the gains we've made in diversifying the faces around the table? Because I worry, I also have made my career on playing the game, but I'm really worried about it. But on the other hand, how are we going to make sure that we don't lose the gains we've made by getting back to where we're going to be able to just live with words without any framing. Somebody want to?
Yeah. I think it's not that difficult. Actually, as I wrote in my last sentence, assuming that there is non-artificial intelligence, we can decide using non-numerical criteria. And I can give you a small example. How do you select your president in the US?
Oh, don't ask.
Yeah, I mean,
Yeah.
you vote. If you have a body, you can. But it is important to list the criteria.
Right.
And
Okay.
the people would consider those criteria. If the criterion is measure and then pick the highest score, this is not a job for humans. You can have a robot to make that, a computer.
Okay, Stephen has a...
Sorry, I know I've talked a lot, but Robin raises a very important question, and this is an issue that comes up, in response to the argument, well, we should maybe get away, put less emphasis on numbers and think more about qualitative aspects, which I think is, an important balance to try to strike. But there is a concern that by, switching to narratives to sort of qualitative assessment, that one then opens up the Pandora's box of bias, and that then leads to judgments that are then based on considerations that favor people that look like me, so, white, heterosexual men, for example. And I think it's a very important consideration to be aware of. I don't think the solution is to go back to numbers and say, well, let's just use the numbers because the numbers are objective, okay? That's a mirage. The numbers are not objective. The numbers are accumulated from lots of subjective decisions and are themselves subject to lots of bias. For example, men tend to self-cite about 50% more frequently than women do across many different disciplines. Men are more often invited to write reviews for journal articles, far outweighing their numbers in the academic community. And there is homophily in peer review, which means that men tend to favor men's papers. And so there are lots of intrinsic biases that are feeding into the numbers and of which we have to be aware. And so the way to address it, both for thinking about the numbers, but also thinking about the qualitative aspects of assessment, is to make sure that your hiring panels are themselves diverse and are also then trained and made very well aware of all the sort of intrinsic and structural barriers that face researchers, that face women, for example, who are less likely to be well known, because it's still true that the vast majority of family care responsibilities falls to women. They are less able, therefore, to travel to conferences, to get themselves known, to do all the informal networking that builds international collaborations, that gets papers with higher citations, that gets them invitations to give keynotes, to write reviews. So there's lots of issues that we need to be aware of in evaluation, and we only address that by making sure that the people involved in making those decisions are properly trained. And if we are professional in our attitude to that, we will be making sure in all our institutions that that is what we're doing.
I think ultimately, any of those kind of decisions are based upon a subjective decision. It's quite hard to reproduce some of those decisions when you've got that information, in a panel about what is the right thing to have funded or who is the right person to have appointed. As it is in any other industry that's not academia, every other job or situation faces the same kind of challenges, to be fair. You might not appoint the right person, the best person. It's quite hard to know that the counterfactual, that you've done the right thing. But I think the key thing, in academia particularly, is, if you are using a mixed bag of evidence and kind of information that you're requiring people to tell you about when you're making a decision, is perhaps to be more transparent about the criteria upon which you're making your decisions. And perhaps, as Stephen said, we need more openness around the reviewing process. If that's the case, if we're moving to an open system and that's happening in the publishing peer review side, why can't some of that happen in the grant side too? And I think at the moment it's totally focused on the addressing issues with publishing rather than thinking about it systemically.
Thanks. That was a very, I like the sort of reflection both on how we should be considering that, how we address these issues, not just in publishing, but across, and the concept that we really have to look at setting criteria and training the people who are making the decisions. It's something that we're seeing everywhere, from how we make our awards in our professional societies to how we hire. I think those are really nice contributions. So do we have any questions from the audience? Please come up to the microphone and line up if you're, oh, he said his hand's up forever.
Hello, I'm Kais from Technical University of Munich. Thank you very much for your talk, and especially thank you for presenting a different narrative that we are not used to listen to as young scientists. My question is a bit, I need a personal answer. So imagine you are 30 and you attended a talk like that, and it told you, okay, you can choose and to follow your values and do science differently. Will you do that and be outside of the system and risk being a failure by the system that we're living in? Or would you play the game and play the system and publish in these journals and get the right metrics and become in a position of power, I would say, or a position where you can change things? What would you do? Thank you.
Okay, who wants to go first? Stephen, look like you're ready.
So I think I showed in my second slide, you are going to die. You therefore only have one shot at life, and you have to be selfish about what you want and what you think is best for your career. So that is always the advice that I would give to early career researchers. The problems that we are addressing are not the fault of the generation that's coming through, and it's very much incumbent on, I think, people of my generation and all the powerful actors in the system to build a system that allows you the freedom. I would encourage you to maybe have those conversations with your PI or supervisor if that's appropriate, to talk about publishing and trying to be judged on the content of what you do, but you have to be realistic. So I am a utopian, I am a fundamentalist in a way, but I am also a pragmatic fundamentalist, and that's a course that I would recommend to everyone.
I think there is not such a strong dilemma that you put it, out of the system, or you play the rules of the system with the rules of the system. I believe there are several ways to play the games of the game, and my approach is very easy. If you are doing what is important for you and the society, you will win, even if you do not obey exactly what you are told to do. I'm very optimistic, and life offers a lot of opportunities for everybody, so no need to worry about that.
Well, you're right. If one is too hasty about rushing to publication, then one can make mistakes. But the point I was addressing there was really address the sort of issue raised by my friend at the Royal Society who had spent 18 months not publishing their work. And this is a tale of woe that is common to many people. In my own worst case, I've now stopped the practice, but I took a paper to 5 journals before I found one that would take it. And that's one of the reasons I like preprints. And I do, preprints are not peer-reviewed, and we do talk as a community about how the importance of peer review. It's a guarantor of the quality of what is done. But actually, it's a useful check, but it's not the difference between night and day. And I think sometimes we oversell it outside the academy. And often, we know well that it's a useful practice and a useful exercise. But in most cases, work coming from good labs, 80–90% of the value of the published work is already there in the unrefereed manuscript. Because when I submit to a preprint server, I am very careful to make sure that I've read through it and that there are no silly mistakes, because that's going to be on me. Peer review is sometimes used by academics as a bit of a comfort blanket. We get someone else to check our work before it goes public. And so I think anyone who's serious about science really puts the work in to do that. I'm sure that's true of you, for example. I'm relaxed about preprints being published, even in medical areas. I know some journalists and newspapers are a bit worried about stuff being published that then might mislead people, but that's down to journalists to be responsible. Preprints are always clearly badged as not peer-reviewed, and therefore should be treated as such and should be evaluated on their own merits. So I'm all for quality, and I don't think quality goes with speed of communication. It'll take you a long time to write the paper if you're anything like me, but actually submitting it to the preprint server doesn't take long and is much quicker than spending months and months trying to get it peer-reviewed at a journal.
Hi, I'm Liz Lewis from Newcastle University, and I wanted to ask your opinion on introducing randomness into grants and promotions and things like that. I read a really interesting article arguing that, people are so equally good. Can we really say what the best science is anyway? So what are we really trying to achieve by, using all these metrics? So would we save ourselves lots of time and money and effort just by saying, you're good and competent, and now let's assign it randomly instead?
That's a fantastic question. I love that. I love that sentiment, and that's happening. There is random experiments going on in grant agencies now. So I think this is really addressing the issue about the precision that we afford peer review that isn't really there. So we say in the grant funding industry, we use peer review to kind of maybe get rid of the grant applications that come in that wouldn't have flown, and you never quite know if that's totally true, but that peer review is quite good at that. But actually beyond that, it's not very good at predicting which ones of the ones that are fundable should be funded, especially if you have a limited amount of money. And as as the lady said, basically there's been studies done in the States, we're looking at NIH basic grants funding, saying that actually in terms of performance output afterwards, which is sometimes a little bit dubious, it was based on publications. Actually, the ones that were the highest ranking did no better than the ones that were the lowest ranking of the funded ones. So could you save yourself a load of money, a load of peer reviewer time, to fund more grants and actually just be a bit more random about which grants you selected? So it's a really good question. The New Zealand National Research Funding Agency is testing this out with a grant scheme at the moment. There's a couple of private foundations. The Volkswagen Foundation are doing this, as are an agency in Denmark, looking at this concept. So I think if it's probably not for the faint-hearted. It's been talked about at a lot of funding agencies, and I think it's really an interesting thing to do, because you can reduce a load of biases by doing this, and maybe save yourself some money. But I think we just need to see if it actually is something that's worth trying. But yeah, it's a really, really interesting area.
I like very much your question or suggestion. And actually, may I take 1 minute to remind you that democracy, as it originally developed in Athens, was based on randomness. Actually, everybody could be the supreme archon of the city. And this was by lot. Except the generals and the water managers, every other position was allocated by lot. So this changes also the culture, because everybody, if you have some probability, that likelihood to get a job, then you feel different, and you develop your skills. Randomness is not just for fun. It's a important attitude. And actually, I agree with you and also with Liz that we should induce randomness in our decisions. And actually, I spoke about the democracy. If you see our lives, if you see how we find our friends or our spouses, everything is about randomness. And we don't trust in simpler things like giving some money. Why? Have you any question? Have you any answer to the why question? I have one. Because randomness cannot be manipulated. Thank you.
Stephen, did you have any randomness?
I would just like to reassure my wife that I believe that we were made for each other. But no, you raised a very good point, and I do like the fact that there are experiments with randomness because I guess to me it's speaking to the stochasticity of our decision making, and I think that element and addressing that element openly is a reminder to us that there is no perfect way of arriving at a judgment or a perfect ranking. This is the thing that irritates me about university rankings. You know, they massage the data. And to me, it's entirely intellectually dishonest to come up with a ranking when they really don't have good enough information to make those assessments. And there are many famous cases. Nature, for example, famously rejected the paper reporting the discovery of graphene twice, a discovery that went on to win the Nobel Prize. And that's not really to take a pot at Nature, it's really to point out that for 2 or 3 reviewers to look at a piece of work and make a big decision about it, that's a genuinely really difficult judgment to make. And we, as human beings, we will get those judgments wrong all the time. And so I think we have to be humble about the frailties of our judgment. And if I can recommend one more book in this session, then Daniel Kahneman's Thinking Fast and Slow is a terrific and terrifying read. Once you finish it, you will have no belief in your own ability to make a reasoned evaluation ever again, because there are so many factors outside our control and outside our consciousness that perturb our decision-making processes. And that's why it has to be a team sport, has to be a diverse panel, and has to be a panel that's thinking about the multiple different dimensions of what counts as success.
Well, I want to thank you all for joining our book club on rewards and recognition in science. We all have an awful lot of reading to do before next year when we can come back and we have a lot to talk about. But I think what this really shows is that our culture is undergoing change, and change is hard, but change is also good, because I think in the long run, it's going to make our science better. It might be faster, stronger, whatever, but I think it'll also make our research better. I think it's also going in the long run make our teaching better and how we communicate with our science. Because I think if we can figure this out, we're going to actually reward people for what we want them to do, as opposed to whatever their H index is, said 15. So we're going to follow this is just part of the great debates. There's going to be one more great debate here about the future of our planet, and then the JPGU, EGU, and AGU are going to do a great debate at the fall meeting, where we'll look both at what is the future of our science and what is the future scientist. And this issue will really come back, because what is the reward structure, and what are we going to recognize for you guys in the back? Should we be doing randoms? Should you be brave? So what I'd like you to do is join me in thanking our panelists one more time. And remember to be brave. Thank you very much.